Today's visual novel is Phenomeno. Phenomeno is a very short visual novel about Yamada Nagito. He's a young man who has recently moved away from home so that he could go to university. Not really having much money on hand, he's in need of a cheap place to rent out. It just so happens that he hears of a mysterious house that grants wishes that is, of course, sold for quite cheap. He rents out the house and, to his dismay, he finds out the hard way that it could potentially be haunted. Each and every night he hears the creaking and groaning of the house, which continually starts to freak him out. But to top things off, he finds the number 7 carved into the wood of the house. And it's not soon after that he finds progressively lower numbers, 6, 5, 4, almost like the house is counting down to something. Thankfully, the main character just so happens to visit an occult website, and he jumps at the opportunity to join one of their group meetings in hope of meeting Yoichi, a mysterious member who has an intense fascination in the occult and might be able to help him with his problem. Right off the bat, you need to know something about this visual novel in that it isn't really the complete story of Phenomeno. It's actually only the first case from the first light novel that was transferred into a visual novel format. As such, being entirely kinetic, there are no choices or gameplay elements. I believe it was simply used as a means to advertise the light novel series, and suffice to say, I think it does a wonderful job at it. It was nice to read a mystery horror visual novel that isn't tasteless in the slightest and has no unnecessary hentai scenes. There is still a hint of mild perversion, of course, because visual novels have no way of escaping from it, but even that is done tastefully, and you'll see what I mean if you read it. Unfortunately, only the first light novel has been translated. And while it was quite entertaining overall, I wouldn't blame anyone if they didn't check it out because it might just leave them craving more of something they may never get. The story of Phenomeno, while not anything original, is most certainly an entertaining one. The thrill of the ongoing countdown, the psychological state of the protagonist, and question of whether or not this is all reality or not managed to make the story compelling all the way through. Though it being a very brief story would probably be most people's problem with it, as it only lasts a little more than an hour, so it's best to think of it as an OVA or even a short film. I was just happy to read a visual novel with good pacing with absolutely no unnecessary fluff for a change, which is of course a big rarity. Since it's really only an introduction though, don't expect to get attached to any of the characters, though I'm still kind of craving to know more about Yoichi myself. The true star of this visual novel, however, is the production side, where it might be one of the most impressive visual novels ever on this front. The art is amazing and is drawn by the same person who did Serial Experiment Lain, which is also one of my favorite anime. While I personally prefer Steins Gate as my favorite art in a visual novel, this does a good job of coming in a close second. Of course, there isn't much of it given the game time, but it certainly does a good job of adding to the atmosphere. There is unfortunately no voice acting, but that's not really always a negative in the visual novel medium, as you can focus reading at your own pace rather than worrying about skipping ahead of the voice acting or getting a jumbled mess of audio if you do skip ahead of the voice acting. Also, this visual novel just has a lot of cool special effects and transitions that really more visual novels should incorporate, and I feel like only Mahou Sky no Yoru really has. I don't want to spoil too much about them, but it makes the game all the more thrilling. I don't really remember the music too much, unfortunately, because it was mostly subtle, which is a decent approach to use when making an atmospheric game, because you don't want the music to necessarily get in the way of the atmosphere. So I've actually heard from a sound production theater guy that it's best to keep the music as subtle as possible to where you don't even notice it ever. Because if you notice the music, he said, if you notice the music in anything, then the sound production team is not doing its job properly and that the music is actually getting in the way and distracting. I don't know if I necessarily agree with all of that, but it's a nice little approach that this game certainly uses. Overall, Phenomeno is a game I can recommend to just about anyone, even people who don't like visual novels. It's short and sweet, there's no hentai in it, and I believe it was entertaining all the way through. In fact, it's a great little starter visual novel. The only real problem, like I said before, is the fact that you might be craving more after reading it. And even if you can read Japanese light novels, it's a shame they were not converted into visual novels like this one, as it had some brilliant techniques to make the experience all the better. So now, for a change, it's spoiler time, because I read this visual novel this year. to a visual novel that I don't think a lot of people really care to have spoiler time on, but okay. If you don't want any spoilers, don't go past this section of the review. So after that initial forum meeting, you learn that Yoichi was stalking Yamada the whole time from outside. Already I knew she was going to be that one weird girl of the series that drives the whole thing, who is basically followed around by our normal dude protagonist. She's the Haruhi of this series. They end up conversing a bit, and you find out how uninterested she truly is about everything, and that she's very weird. She drinks sodas in a weird kind of cultish way, and anything that isn't the occult doesn't make her feel alive. She's basically Haruhi, okay? Except she's more Kudere than Genki Girl. And so the conversation between her and him is kind of awkward because she is not even remotely sociable. This could have easily been very obnoxious, but I found it more humorous than anything because, well, I like Hyon and Haruhi's chemistry as well. And that's probably due to the good pacing as well. A lot of visual novels have a tendency to make conversations just go on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, and they never shut up. They never shut up. And this one doesn't have that problem, obviously, so that's probably why it didn't feel awkward. If they talk for 15 minutes, and that's a norm in visual novels for them to just have two people talk for 15 minutes straight to each other, then yeah, it probably would have got very awkward. So he ends up taking her to the house, and due to some unexplained phenomena, she ends up barfing all over the place. I'm not sure if her body is just super sensitive to the spiritual realm or not, but I'm just guessing that's mostly the case. And that's where I started to get more intrigued by Yoshi. This is a girl who takes so little care of herself that she doesn't even bathe properly, nor does she seem to care if these horror-like situations have a negative effect on her. So the real question is, why is she so passionate about the occult, but has so little passion for anything else? Will we ever see a human side to her character? It's those little things that kind of want me to read more. Also, at this point, I was still questioning on whether or not this story was going to actually make the horror side of things reality or fantasy. As they explore the house, Yoichi and Yamada do a lot of bickering about the countdown beginning at 7, when normally countdowns should start at 10, which Yamada just says it's not something a human like him could understand because it's probably dealing with the spiritual realm. Eventually, they find the number 3 carved down, and Yamada finally breaks down. He chooses to move out and gets a house somewhere else that seems like no haunting could possibly ever happen in, and this is a bit of a time skip as well. Though it's clearly obvious that bad things are going to continue to happen, he meets a girl from the so-called Benkei Research Club called Kurimoto Shina. She accuses him of something that he has no recollection of, which clearly foreshadows that, in fact, more bad things will happen to him. As for her character, she really isn't given much time between the two cases I read, but I guess she'll serve as a second love interest in the future, which is usually the norm. I think this meeting was a bit overly anime, and her character kind of was giving off this immature tsundere vibe a bit too strongly. When she's talking about the occult stuff, her character is fine, but otherwise the base character they are giving us is probably the area which the visual novel is the weakest so far. Later that night, Yamada has a creepy and somewhat erotic dream about embracing Yoichi, who appears to be in a rare state of excitement which she normally only would have from topics of the occult. Thankfully, this scene is also very creepy, and it doesn't turn into a hentai scene of any sort, so it's pretty tastefully done like I said earlier in the review. However, while at first you think the body is that of Yamada, he soon realizes it's actually the old man that he has seen previously at the house. I'm not quite sure what entirely this scene implies besides the fact that Yamada is clearly still being haunted. I mean, obviously we can take away from it that Yamada is heavily infatuated with Yoichi, despite the fact that he's really not able to converse with her very well. But other than that, I'm not sure we can take anything away from Yoichi with this scene, other than what we already know, that she only feels alive when things of the occult are brought into the picture. While Yamada just tries to write it off as a dream, you know bad things are coming soon if something like that happens, and it's not long after until Yamada finds the number 2 near him. In a panic, he tries to post on the forum to ask for help from Yoichi, but instead Shina is in fact the one who replies. He meets up with her and finds out that the club she basically manages is full of weird people who seem to also deal with the spiritual realm in some way. They basically confirm for him that he's rather screwed at this point and they have to take drastic measures. Once again, I don't think the way Sheena actually went about inviting him to this club to have the problem fixed was at all efficient, and I guess it was mainly done to show her tsundere tendency, but tsundere tendencies are always best when they come unexpectedly rather when they're shoved in your face, and it just made her seem like a bitch, quite honestly. Though in her defense, the next scene sheds some light on why she may be like this. They end up having to take Yamada back to the House of Wishes in order to potentially purify him from this haunting, and it's there they encounter Yoichi once again. Sheena explains to her that she's seen several people like Yoichi who have delved too far in the other realm, and nothing good comes of it. This hints that her perhaps bitchy attitude is due to her growing bitter from too many unsaved cases and too many corrupted people that she's had to deal with. So there's still room for her to be interesting, even if her introduction might come off too strong. They finally are able to help Yamada with his problem, and they try to write it off that it was all his own doing and in his head because of all the stress of moving to a new town and in an uncomfortable environment. However, Yoichi explains afterwards that Sheena was just trying to be kind and not have him worry or think about this kind of stuff, because she doesn't want him to be involved with the occult anymore. However, our main character is either so infatuated with Yoichi or is just an extreme masochist that he decides to continue engaging in occult activity with her anyway. This is probably where the novels are going to be a bit on the side with the main character, because even in the second case he continues to complain and say he will never engage in the occult again, but then he says his curiosity just won't let him go and he just wants to see what Yoishi's is up to, so there you go. Which makes him a little annoying at present, and he doesn't really have the personality or development quite yet to make him a likable or interesting main character. So if there's one thing the novels will need to work on in later volumes, it's Yamada and Sheena's character. But overall, as for the case this visual novel covered, like said before, it was a fun ride, and therefore, I can't really complain, because that's really all I asked for is for entertainment.